The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Marcus Thompson pushed his cleaning cart down the empty hallway of the Naval Special Warfare Command building. It was past midnight, and the offices that buzzed with activity during the day now stood silent and dark. Marcus preferred it this way. The quiet gave him time to think, and, more importantly, it meant fewer people around to ask questions he didn't want to answer. At 42, Marcus had the kind of weathered face that spoke of experiences beyond his years. His hands, rough and calloused, moved efficiently as he emptied trash bins and wiped down surfaces. To anyone watching, he was just another night shift janitor doing his job. They couldn't see the careful way his eyes scanned each room he entered, or how he instinctively positioned himself near exits. Old habits died hard. "Hey, janitor guy," a voice called out from behind him. Marcus turned to see Admiral Richard Hayes approaching with his usual swagger. The Admiral was known throughout the base for his sharp tongue and even sharper opinions about who belonged in their world and who didn't. "It's Marcus, sir," he replied quietly, continuing to dust the display cases that lined the corridor. These cases held memories he knew all too well, photographs of SEAL teams, commendation medals, and mission patches from operations around the world. Admiral Hayes chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Right, Marcus. You know, I was just telling some of the guys about you. Funny thing, someone mentioned you used to have a call sign. Lone Eagle, wasn't it?" The Admiral's tone carried clear mockery. Pretty fancy name for someone who cleans toilets for a living now. Marcus's hand paused for just a moment on the glass case before resuming its steady motion. "Just doing my job, sir." "Oh, I'm sure you are," Hayes continued, clearly enjoying himself. "I just find it amusing how some people like to inflate their past service. A janitor with a call sign. That's a good one. What's next? Are you going to tell me you were a war hero too?" Other officers had begun to gather, drawn by the Admiral's loud voice and the promise of entertainment. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others already smirking in anticipation of the show. He'd been through this before. The assumptions, the jokes, the complete dismissal of who he used to be. "I never claimed to be anything I'm not, sir," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the growing audience. Admiral Hayes stepped closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a conspiratorial whisper, but was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Listen, janitor, I don't know what unit you think you served in, but I know every SEAL worth knowing. I've never heard of any Lone Eagle, especially not one who ended up pushing a mop around a Navy building." The small crowd of officers chuckled appreciatively. Marcus continued cleaning, his movements never changing pace, never showing the storm of memories that Hayes's words had stirred up. He thought about his daughter Emma, asleep at home, trusting him to come back from work safely every morning. He thought about the bills that needed paying and the stable life he was building for both of them. These things mattered more than his pride. "Maybe you were in the Navy," Hayes continued, warming to his theme. "Maybe you even saw some action. But a SEAL? With a call sign like Lone Eagle? Son, that sounds like something out of a bad action movie." Marcus finally stopped cleaning and turned to face the Admiral directly. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something that made the more observant officers in the group take a half step back. But it passed quickly, replaced by the same quiet dignity he always carried. "You're right, sir. It does sound like a movie," Marcus said simply. "Will there be anything else? I have floors to finish on the 3rd level." Admiral Hayes waved him away dismissively. "Run along, janitor. Try not to let those action movie fantasies interfere with your real work." As Marcus pushed his cart toward the elevator, the Admiral turned to his audience with a wide grin. "Can you believe that? These guys who wash out of basic training, they all want to pretend they were operators. Lone Eagle. I bet he got that nickname because he was alone so much, nobody wanted to work with him." The laughter that followed echoed down the hallway as the elevator doors closed behind Marcus. Inside the small space, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The faces of his old team flashed through his mind. Rodriguez, who always made terrible jokes before missions. Miller, who could crack any code the enemy threw at them. Thompson was him. That life was over. When the elevator reached the third floor, Marcus stepped out and resumed his work. Room by room, he cleaned offices where men and women planned operations he once would have led. He emptied trash cans filled with classified documents that had been properly shredded, documents about missions and places he'd been but could never talk about. In Admiral Hayes's office, Marcus took extra care with his work. The walls were covered with photographs of the Admiral with various dignitaries and fellow officers. Awards and commendations filled every available space, each one polished to a mirror shine. Marcus noticed there were no combat photos, no pictures from deployed units. This was a different kind of Navy career, important certainly, but played out in conference rooms and Pentagon briefings rather than in the field. As he cleaned the Admiral's desk, Marcus saw the daily intelligence briefing that had been left open. His eyes automatically scanned the contents. Old training kicking in despite himself. Terrorist cell movements in Syria. Supply line disruptions in Afghanistan. A hostage situation developing in Somalia that had the Pentagon concerned. Marcus had to stop himself from reading further. That world wasn't his anymore. By the time his shift ended at 6 in the morning, the building was beginning to stir with early arrivals. Marcus punched out and made his way to the parking garage, where his 10-year-old Honda Civic waited next to the luxury cars of officers and contractors. The contrast wasn't lost on him, but it didn't sting the way it once had. He'd learned to measure success differently. The drive home took him through the quiet suburban neighborhood where he and Emma had lived for the past 3 years. The small apartment complex wasn't much, but it was clean and safe with good schools nearby. That's what mattered now. Emma was awake when he got home, sitting at their tiny kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and her homework spread out around her. At 8 years old, she had her mother's dark hair and serious eyes, but she'd inherited Marcus's stubborn determination. "How was work, Dad?" she asked without looking up from her math problems. "Same as always, sweetheart," Marcus replied, hanging his jacket on the back of a chair. "How's the homework coming?" "Mrs. Peterson says I'm the best at multiplication tables in the whole 3rd grade," Emma announced proudly. Marcus smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn since Admiral Hayes had started his show the night before. "That's my girl. Smart and determined, just like your mom." Emma looked up at him then, and Marcus saw the question in her eyes as she asked in different ways, but never directly. She was too young to understand why they lived the way they did, why other kids' dads wore suits to work while hers came home smelling like industrial cleaner. She was too young to know about the nightmares that still woke him some nights, or about the career he'd walked away from to keep her safe and give her a normal life. "Dad, Tommy's dad is taking us to see the Blue Angels this weekend. Can we go?" Marcus hesitated. Air shows meant crowds, noise, and too many reminders of the life he'd left behind. But Emma's hopeful expression melted his resolve. "Sure, sweetheart. We can go." As Emma returned to her homework, Marcus made himself coffee and sat down across from her. Through the window, he could see other parents getting ready for work, accountants, teachers, salespeople living ordinary lives with ordinary concerns. Part of him envied them their simplicity, their ability to worry about mortgages and parent-teacher conferences instead of wondering if today would be the day his past caught up with him. His phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor at the cleaning company. "Good work last night. Admiral Hayes specifically mentioned how thorough you were. Keep it up." Marcus almost laughed at the irony. Admiral Hayes had no idea that the man he'd humiliated was probably one of the few people in that building who could have told him exactly what was wrong with the intelligence briefing he'd left on his desk, or who could have planned a mission to extract those hostages in Somalia. But those days were over. Marcus Thompson, the man who'd earned the call sign Lone Eagle through 4 tours in the most dangerous places on Earth, was dead and buried. What remained was Emma's dad, a night shift janitor who just wanted to live quietly and raise his daughter in peace. As he helped Emma pack her backpack for school, Marcus pushed thoughts of Admiral Hayes and his cruel laughter to the back of his mind. Let them have their jokes. Let them think they knew who he was based on his job title, and his refusal to defend himself. None of it mattered as long as Emma was safe and happy. But somewhere in the back of his mind, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed new life was about to face a test he wasn't sure he was ready for. The world he'd left behind had a way of finding people, no matter how well they thought they'd hidden. 3 weeks had passed since Admiral Hayes's humiliating display in the hallway, but the story had taken on a life of its own throughout the Naval Special Warfare Command. Marcus had become something of a running joke among certain circles. The janitor who thought he was a SEAL, the man with delusions of grandeur who pushed a mop around the very building where real operators planned real missions. Marcus endured it all with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else in his life. When officers smirked as he passed, he nodded politely and continued with his work. When someone would stage whisper about Lone Eagle, just loud enough for him to hear, he kept his expression neutral and his pace steady. The comments weren't new. He'd faced similar situations at his previous jobs before finding this position. What was different here was the organized nature of the mockery, the way it had become a form of entertainment for people who should have known better. The worst part wasn't the jokes themselves, but watching good people get swept up in them. Marcus had noticed Commander Sarah Mitchell, a decorated officer who'd always treated him with respect, now avoiding eye contact when their paths crossed. Young Lieutenant Jackson, who used to thank him for keeping the offices clean, now wore the same smirk as the others when Marcus's name came up in conversation. It was Admiral Hayes who had started it all, but the culture he'd created was spreading like a virus through the command. Marcus understood the psychology of it. These men and women lived under enormous pressure, carrying the weight of national security on their shoulders. Having someone to look down on, someone to joke about, provided a release valve for that stress. He just happened to be the target. On a Thursday evening in late October, Marcus was cleaning the conference room where the senior staff held their daily briefings when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. The situation in Somalia has deteriorated rapidly, Commander Mitchell was saying to Admiral Hayes. The hostages are being moved to a secondary location, and our window for extraction is closing fast. Marcus paused in his cleaning, his hands automatically continuing their work while his mind focused entirely on the conversation. Through the open door, he could see the tactical display showing satellite imagery of what looked like a compound in Mogadishu. "What are our options?" Admiral Hayes asked. "Limited," replied Colonel Martinez from the Marine Liaison Office. "The original rescue plan assumed we'd have 48 hours to position assets. Now we're looking at maybe 6 hours before they disappear into the countryside completely." Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he absorbed the details. 2 American aid workers, captured 3 days ago while delivering medical supplies to a refugee camp. Their captors were demanding the release of 5 high-value targets in exchange for the hostages' lives. The Pentagon's official position was no negotiation, but that left military extraction as the only option. "The problem is access," Commander Mitchell continued. "The compound is surrounded by residential buildings, and our intelligence on the interior layout is limited. Any assault would be high risk for both the hostages and the assault team." Admiral Hayes studied the display with a frown. "What about the SEAL team stationed on the Roosevelt? They've been training for urban rescue operations." "They're good," Colonel Martinez admitted, "but this isn't a training scenario. The margins for error are razor thin, and we're asking them to go in essentially blind. One wrong turn, one unexpected door, and we could lose everyone." Marcus set down his spray bottle with slightly more force than necessary, causing all 3 officers to look in his direction. He mumbled an apology and moved to the far side of the room, but he could feel the weight of their stares. "Actually," Admiral Hayes said with a cruel smile, "maybe we should ask our resident expert. Hey, Lone Eagle, you got any thoughts on small unit tactics?" The other officers shifted uncomfortably, but Admiral Hayes was clearly enjoying himself. "Come on, don't be shy. You've been listening to classified briefings for the past 20 minutes. Surely someone with your extensive combat experience has some insights to share." Marcus straightened up slowly, his eyes meeting Admiral Hayes's for the first time in weeks. "I apologize, sir. I'll finish cleaning this room later." "No, no, I insist," Admiral Hayes continued, his voice dripping with false enthusiasm. "This is a perfect opportunity for you to prove all those war stories. Tell us, how would the great Lone Eagle handle a hostage rescue in an urban environment with limited intelligence and a 6-hour window?" The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. Commander Mitchell looked mortified by her superior's behavior, while Colonel Martinez stared at his hands. Marcus stood motionless for a long moment, his cleaning supplies forgotten. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried a weight that made everyone in the room pay attention. 6 hours isn't enough for a full assault team insertion. Too many variables, too many people to coordinate. The compound layout you're showing there, I can see at least 3 major choke points that would trap a standard entry team. Admiral Hayes's smirk faltered slightly. "Oh, really? And what would you suggest instead, Janitor?" Marcus moved closer to the tactical display, his eyes scanning the satellite imagery with the practiced gaze of someone who'd analyzed countless similar situations. "Single operator insertion through the drainage system here," he said, pointing to a spot on the eastern side of the compound. "Bypass the perimeter security entirely. The thermal signature shows the hostages are being held in this building, 2nd floor, northwest corner. One man could be in and out with both packages in under 40 minutes. The room had gone completely quiet. Commander Mitchell leaned forward, studying the display with new interest. "The drainage system, our intelligence didn't identify that as a viable entry point." "Because your intelligence is looking at it wrong," Marcus replied, his finger tracing a path on the screen. "These aren't storm drains. They're part of an old irrigation system from when this area was farmland. I've used identical systems in 3 different countries. The main tunnel runs directly under the compound's foundation." Colonel Martinez stood up abruptly. "How could you possibly know that?" Marcus realized he'd said too much. The careful mask he'd worn for 3 years was slipping, and these people were getting a glimpse of who he really was. He stepped back from the display, but the damage was done. Admiral Hayes was staring at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "You're telling me that a janitor somehow knows the historical land use patterns of a compound in Somalia?" "I read a lot," Marcus said lamely, but even he could hear how inadequate the explanation sounded. "Sir," Commander Mitchell interrupted, her voice thoughtful, "what he's describing, the tactical approach, it's actually sound. I've never seen anyone analyze a hostile insertion that quickly or that accurately." Admiral Hayes's face was beginning to flush with anger. "Are you seriously telling me that you're taking tactical advice from the building custodian?" "I'm saying that his assessment is more thorough than anything our planning team has produced in the last 48 hours, Mitchell replied firmly. The drainage system approach could work. Marcus knew he had to get out of that room before the situation deteriorated further. "I should really finish my rounds," he said, moving toward his cart. "Wait," Colonel Martinez called out. "The single operator insertion, you said 40 minutes in and out. That's incredibly fast for a hostage extraction." Marcus paused at the doorway, knowing that every word he spoke was digging him deeper into a hole he'd spent 3 years trying to stay out of. 40 minutes if everything goes according to plan. But it wouldn't. There are too many unknowns, too many ways for a single operator to get trapped or overwhelmed. The smart play would be to wait for better intelligence or a larger window for a conventional assault. But if waiting wasn't an option, Admiral Hayes asked, his voice sharp with suspicion, "If you had to go in tonight?" Marcus turned back to face them, and for just a moment, the mask slipped completely. The quiet janitor disappeared, replaced by someone who'd spent years making life and death decisions in the world's most dangerous places. "If I had to go in tonight, I'd need current thermal imaging, updated security rotations, and a clear extraction route that doesn't depend on the same entry point. I'd also want a sniper providing overwatch from this position." He pointed to a building 3 blocks away, "and a backup team stage here in case things went sideways." The silence that followed was deafening. Admiral Hayes was staring at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time, while Commander Mitchell was frantically taking notes on everything he'd said. "Who are you?" Admiral Hayes whispered. Marcus picked up his spray bottle and cloth, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his mind. "I'm the guy who cleaned your office, sir. Nothing more." But as he pushed his card out of the conference room, Marcus knew that his carefully constructed new life had just taken a massive hit. The questions would come now, the investigations, the digging into his past. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd sacrificed to build a safe, normal life for Emma, was hanging by a thread. Behind him, he could hear Admiral Hayes barking orders about security clearances and background checks. The man who'd been so quick to mock the janitor with a made-up call sign was now demanding to know everything about Marcus Thompson's military service record. As Marcus continued his rounds through the empty hallways, his mind was already working on contingency plans. How quickly could he and Emma disappear if necessary? How much of their life would they have to abandon to stay ahead of questions he couldn't answer? But even as these thoughts raced through his head, Marcus couldn't shake a different feeling, a small, dangerous part of him that had enjoyed being in that room, analyzing the tactical situation, thinking like the operator he used to be. For just a few minutes, he'd felt like himself again, and that feeling was both terrifying and intoxicating. The next few days would determine whether Marcus Thompson could continue his quiet existence as a single father trying to raise his daughter in peace, or whether the man called Lone Eagle would be forced back into a world he'd thought he'd left behind forever. The call came at 3:17 a.m., jolting Marcus awake from the restless sleep that had become his norm since the conference room incident 3 days ago. He grabbed his phone, expecting his supervisor with a last-minute shift change, but the number on the screen made his blood run cold. It was a number he hadn't seen in over 3 years, one that officially didn't exist. "Thompson," he answered, his voice automatically dropping to the clipped, professional tone he'd thought he'd left behind. "Lone Eagle." The voice on the other end belonged to Director James Hoffman, the man who'd run Marcus's old unit and the only person who knew the real reason Marcus had walked away from his career. "We need to talk." Marcus was already out of bed, checking on Emma through her half-open bedroom door. She was sleeping peacefully, her homework for tomorrow spread across her desk exactly as she'd left it. The sight of her small form under her pink comforter strengthened his resolve. "I'm done with that life, Jim. You know why. I know what you told me 3 years ago," Hoffman replied. "But circumstances have changed. Your little performance at the Naval Command Building made some interesting waves." Marcus cursed under his breath. He'd known this moment would come, had prepared for it, but the reality was still like a punch to the gut. "Who talked? Does it matter?" Word reached the Pentagon that a janitor provided tactical analysis that was not only accurate, but more sophisticated than anything their planning teams had developed. People started asking questions. Marcus, the kind of questions that lead to answers you might not like. Moving to his kitchen window, Marcus peered through the blinds at the quiet street below. Everything looked normal. The same parked cars, the same empty sidewalks, the same peaceful suburban neighborhood where he'd tried to build a normal life for his daughter. But he knew that normalcy was an illusion that could shatter at any moment. "What do you want, Jim?" "The Somalia situation has escalated. The hostages were moved again, just like you predicted. The conventional rescue plans have all been scrubbed as too risky. The president wants options, and someone in the Pentagon mentioned that there was an unconventional approach suggested by..." Hoffman paused. "Let's call him a consultant." Marcus closed his eyes, seeing where this was heading. "No. The current estimate is that both hostages will be dead within 24 hours if we don't act. The captors have stopped negotiating and started making demands that tell us they're planning to cut their losses and eliminate the witnesses. Send someone else. You've got plenty of operators who can handle this. Not for this mission. The window is too narrow, the intelligence too thin, and the political ramifications too severe if we fail. This needs someone who can adapt on the fly, who's comfortable working alone in hostile territory, who has experience with exactly this type of urban extraction." Marcus knew Hoffman was right, could feel the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. But he also thought about Emma, who would wake up in 4 hours expecting her father to help her with her science project. He thought about the life he'd built, the promises he'd made to himself, and to his daughter's memory of her mother. "I can't, Jim. Emma needs me here. She needs stability, not a father who disappears for weeks at a time and comes back damaged. What if I told you this could be the last time?" The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus had heard similar promises before, knew how easily one more mission could turn into a career that consumed everything else in a person's life. But something in Hoffman's tone was different this time. "What do you mean? Your identity was compromised the moment you opened your mouth in that conference room. Admiral Hayes has already filed a formal inquiry about your background. How long do you think it'll be before some enterprising Pentagon analyst connects Marcus Thompson, night shift janitor, with Marcus Lone Eagle Thompson, decorated special operations veteran?" Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. He'd always known this day might come, but he'd hoped for more time, more years of normalcy before the past caught up with him. "Even if they connect the names, my service record is classified at the highest levels. They won't be able to access the details." Hoffman's laugh was bitter. "You really think classification levels matter when an admiral wants answers? Hayes has already reached out to contacts at JSOC. It's only a matter of time before someone with the right clearances starts digging into why a former SEAL with your background is pushing a mop around a Navy building." The truth of it hit Marcus like a physical blow. His carefully constructed anonymity was crumbling, and once it fell completely, Emma would be exposed to scrutiny and questions he'd never wanted her to face. People would want to know about her mother, about the mission that went wrong, about why Marcus had walked away from everything he'd worked for to become a single father living paycheck to paycheck. "There's another option," Hoffman continued, his voice gentler now. "You take this mission, you do what you do best, and afterward we arrange for a completely new identity for both you and Emma. New names, new location, new life. This time we make sure the past stays buried for good." Marcus was quiet for a long time, wrestling with the decision that could determine the rest of his and his daughter's lives. Through Emma's bedroom door, he could hear her soft breathing, the sound of innocence that he'd sworn to protect above all else. The mission parameters? Single operator insertion, just like you outlined. Extract 2 hostages from a fortified compound in Mogadishu. The drainage system approach you identified is our best shot, but it's not going to be easy. The compound is heavily guarded. The hostages are likely to be moved again if they suspect rescue is imminent, and you be going in without backup. Extraction plan? Fast boat to a carrier group 60 miles offshore. We have you in and out of country in under 18 hours. Marcus found himself automatically analyzing the mission profile, his mind shifting into the tactical mode he'd thought he'd left behind. Despite his reservations, he could feel the old excitement building. The challenge of the impossible mission, the knowledge that 2 innocent lives hung in the balance. "I need full autonomy on tactical decisions. No micromanagement from Washington, no real-time oversight that could compromise the mission if communications are detected. Done. And I want guarantees about Emma's safety while I'm gone. Full protection detail. And if something happens to me, she'll be taken care of. I give you my word." Marcus knew Hoffman's word was solid gold. The man had never broken a promise in the 15 years Marcus had known him. But the thought of leaving Emma, even for 18 hours, even with protection, made his chest tight with anxiety. "I need to think about it. Marcus, I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. These hostages, one of them is Dr. Sarah Chun, the epidemiologist who's been working to contain the outbreak in East Africa. The other is Father Miguel Santos, a priest who's been running refugee camps for 3 years. They're good people who were just trying to help. The manipulation was obvious, but effective. Marcus had always been vulnerable to appeals based on protecting innocence, and Hoffman knew exactly which buttons to push. But beyond the manipulation was a truth Marcus couldn't ignore. He was probably the only person with both the skills and the knowledge necessary to pull off this rescue. How long do I have to decide? The insertion window opens in 14 hours. If you're going, you need to be wheels up in 8. Marcus looked around his small apartment, taking in the details of the life he'd built over the past 3 years. Emma's drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. The couch where they watched movies on Friday nights. The bookshelf where he helped her with homework every evening. All of it could be preserved if he took this mission and accepted Hoffman's offer of new identities. All of it would be destroyed if he refused, and Admiral Hayes' investigation exposed who he really was. If I do this, Marcus said finally, it's the last time. After this, Lone Eagle is dead and buried for good. I want your personal guarantee on that. You have it. Marcus ended the call and sat in his dark kitchen for a long time, listening to the sounds of his daughter sleeping and trying to convince himself that he had a choice. But deep down, he knew the decision had been made the moment he'd opened his mouth in that conference room. The life he'd built was already over. Now it was just a question of whether he could salvage something from the wreckage. At 5 a.m., he made coffee and sat down to write a letter for Emma, trying to explain in age-appropriate terms why Daddy had to go away for a little while. He told her he loved her, that he was proud of her, and that no matter what happened, she should always remember that everything he'd ever done was to keep her safe. As the sun rose over their quiet neighborhood, Marcus Thompson began preparing for what would either be his final mission as Lone Eagle or the last decision he'd ever make. Either way, the man who'd spent 3 years pushing a mop through Navy hallways was about to remind the world why he'd once been considered one of the most dangerous operators alive. The only question now was whether Marcus Thompson would come home to finish raising his daughter, or whether Emma would have to learn to live with the knowledge that her father had died as he'd lived, try to save people he'd never met in places most people couldn't find on a map. 18 hours later, Marcus Thompson sat in the back of a military transport plane, watching the lights of Somalia disappear beneath the clouds. Both hostages were alive and unharmed, secured in a medical bay where Navy corpsmen were treating them for dehydration and minor injuries. The mission had gone exactly as planned, a perfect insertion through the drainage system, 43 minutes inside the compound, and an extraction so clean that the captors didn't realize their prisoners were gone until morning. But Marcus felt no satisfaction in the success. His body ached from crawling through centuries-old irrigation tunnels. His hands were torn from scaling compound walls in complete darkness, and his mind kept drifting to the moment 12 hours earlier when he'd kissed Emma goodbye, knowing there was a real chance he might never see her again. Director Hoffman sat across from him, reviewing after-action reports on a secure tablet. Flawless execution, he said without looking up. The president sends his personal thanks. Marcus stared out the small window at the endless ocean below. What about Admiral Hayes? Already handled. He's been briefed on your background and sworn to secrecy. Officially, you were never involved in this operation, and your tactical analysis was just an interesting coincidence from someone who watches too many war movies. He's going to have questions. He's going to have orders to mind his own business and stop harassing Navy contractors, Hoffman replied firmly. Hayes may be an admiral, but there are people above him who understand the value of keeping certain operators happy and healthy. Marcus finally turned away from the window. And Emma? Hoffman closed the tablet and met Marcus's gaze directly. She's fine. Spent the night with Mrs. Garcia from 4B. Thinks you had to work a double shift because someone called in sick. She made you breakfast and left it in the refrigerator with a note saying she hopes you're not too tired. The image of Emma carefully preparing his breakfast, worried about whether he was getting enough sleep, nearly broke Marcus's composure. Everything he'd done, every sacrifice he'd made, was to protect her innocence and give her a normal childhood. The fact that she was still concerned about such ordinary things meant he'd succeeded, at least for now. New identities? Marcus asked. If you want them. New names, new location, enough money to start over wherever you choose. Emma would never have to know about any of this. Marcus considered the offer, as he'd been doing throughout the long flight home. A fresh start, a chance to bury Lone Eagle permanently and become someone new. No more looking over his shoulder. No more wondering when the past would catch up with them. Emma could grow up completely free of the shadow cast by her father's former life. But something held him back. Maybe it was the realization that running would always be temporary, that there would always be another Admiral Hayes ready to ask uncomfortable questions. Maybe it was the knowledge that his skills that had saved 2 innocent lives just hours ago, might be needed again someday. Or maybe it was simply exhaustion with the constant effort required to pretend to be someone he wasn't. "I want to go home," Marcus said finally. "To our home, with our names, to our life." Hoffman raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Hayes may keep quiet, but word has already spread through certain circles about the janitor who provided world-class tactical analysis. "You're going to attract attention. Then, I'll deal with attention. I'm tired of hiding, Jim. Tired of pretending that part of my life never existed." Maybe it's time for Emma to learn that her father is more than just a night shift custodian. And if people start asking questions about her mother, about why you left the teams. Marcus was quiet for a long time, remembering Sarah, Emma's mother, and the mission that had cost her life. The guilt he carried wasn't just about losing a teammate and a wife. It was about the choices that had led to her death, the risks they'd both taken in pursuit of a greater good. For 3 years, he tried to honor her memory by giving Emma the safe, normal life Sarah would have wanted for their daughter. Then, "I'll tell Emma the truth when she's old enough to understand it. That her mother was a hero who died trying to save other people, and that her father loved her enough to walk away from everything else to make sure Emma grew up safe." The plane began its descent toward the airfield where Marcus had started this journey less than a day ago. Soon he'd be back in his Honda Civic, driving through suburban streets to the small apartment where his 8-year-old daughter was probably just waking up and getting ready for school. "There's going to be a price for this decision," Hoffman warned. "People in our line of work don't usually get to retire gracefully and live normal lives. There will always be someone who thinks you owe them one more mission, one more favor, one more use of skills that very few people possess." Marcus understood the warning. By choosing to stay Marcus Thompson rather than disappearing into a new identity, he was accepting that Lone Eagle would always be part of who he was. There would be phone calls at 3 a.m., desperate situations where only someone with his particular expertise could make the difference between success and catastrophe. The question was whether he could balance those obligations with his responsibilities as a father. "Then, I'll have to learn to say no," Marcus replied. "Emma comes first, always. If that means some missions fail because I'm not available, that's a burden I'll have to live with." Hoffman smiled for the first time since Marcus had known him. "You know, Sarah would be proud of the man you've become. The operator she married was brilliant, but he was also reckless and addicted to the adrenaline. The man sitting across from me has learned what really matters." As the plane touched down, Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't pretending to be someone else. He wasn't hiding from his past or apologizing for his skills. He was simply Marcus Thompson, Emma's father, former Navy SEAL, and a man who'd figured out how to balance duty to country with duty to family. The ride back to his apartment complex took 40 minutes through morning traffic. Marcus used the time to think about how he'd explain his sudden absence to Emma, how he'd handle the inevitable questions from his supervisor about missing his shift, and how he'd navigate the new reality of being known within certain circles as something more than just a janitor. But as he pulled into his parking space and saw Mrs. Garcia waiting by his door with Emma, who was dressed for school and clutching a lunchbox decorated with cartoon princesses, all those concerns faded into the background. His daughter's face lit up when she saw him, and she ran across the parking lot and threw her arms around his waist. "Daddy, you look tired. Did you have to clean a lot of extra offices?" Marcus knelt down to her level, looking into eyes that held all the innocence and trust he'd fought so hard to preserve. Something like that, "Sweetheart. But I'm home now, and I'm not going anywhere." Later that morning, after Emma had gone to school and Mrs. Garcia had returned to her apartment with Marcus's grateful thanks, He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his phone. There were 17 missed calls from his supervisor, 3 voicemails from Admiral Hayes' office, and a text message from an unknown number that simply read, "Thank you. The world is safer because of what you did." SC. Dr. Sarah Chun, the epidemiologist he'd rescued, was already back at work trying to contain a disease outbreak that could affect millions of people. Father Miguel Santos was back at his refugee camp, providing hope and assistance to people who had lost everything. Their work would continue because Marcus had been willing to risk everything to save them. But the mission that mattered most was just beginning. At 3:15 p.m., Emma would come home from school expecting help with her math homework. At 6:30, they'd have dinner together while she told him about her day. At 8 p.m., he'd read her a story before tucking her in a bed. These were the missions that defined Marcus Thompson now, the operations that mattered more than anything he'd ever done in uniform. His phone rang, and Marcus saw Admiral Hayes' number on screen. He hesitated for a moment, then answered, "Marcus Thompson." "Mr. Thompson." Admiral Hayes' voice was completely different from the mocking tone he'd used just days before. I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. I had no idea who you were or what you'd done for this country." Marcus smiled, remembering the arrogant officer who'd taken such pleasure in humiliating the night shift janitor. "Apology accepted, Admiral. We all make assumptions sometimes. I've been reading your service record. What I can access of it, anyway. The things you've done, the lives you've saved, and I treated you like garbage because of your job title. I'm a janitor, Admiral. That's not something I'm ashamed of. It's honest work that lets me provide for my daughter and be home when she needs me. The fact that I used to do other things doesn't make that any less valuable." There was a long pause before Admiral Hayes spoke again. "If you ever need anything, recommendations, references, help finding other employment, please don't hesitate to ask. It would be an honor to assist you in any way I can." "Actually," Marcus said, looking around his small apartment, "I like my job just fine. Good hours, decent pay, and it keeps me close to home. I think I'll stick with it." After ending the call, Marcus walked to Emma's bedroom and looked around at the pictures on her desk, the awards from school, the books they'd read together. This was what he'd built with 3 years of night shifts and careful anonymity. This was what he'd protected by walking away from a career that had defined him since he was 18 years old. Tomorrow night, he'd be back at the Naval Special Warfare Command building, pushing his cleaning cart through hallways where people now knew exactly who he was and what he'd accomplished. Some would treat him differently, with a newfound respect that was both gratifying and slightly annoying. Others might try to draw him into conversations about tactics and operations, seeking to tap into expertise they'd never suspected he possessed. But Marcus Thompson, the man who'd once been known as Lone Eagle, had found something more valuable than respect or recognition. He'd found peace with who he was, all of who he was. A decorated veteran who'd served his country with distinction, a father who'd sacrificed everything to raise his daughter properly, and a man who understood that true strength sometimes meant choosing the quiet life over the dramatic one. When Emma came home that afternoon, she found her father sitting at the kitchen table with her homework spread out and a smile on his face that seemed different somehow, more relaxed, more genuine than the careful expressions he'd worn for the past 3 years. "Ready for math?" he asked, and Emma grinned and climbed in the chair beside him, completely unaware that her father had just saved 2 lives and reminded himself what kind of hero he wanted to be. Outside, the suburban neighborhood continued its peaceful routine, filled with ordinary families living ordinary lives. And in one small apartment, a former special operations legend helped his 8-year-old daughter with multiplication tables, both of them exactly where they belonged.